bringing this up to just to bring a counterpoint to my own point. Have we ever thought about this? And people are going to hate me, but I'm going to do it. That maybe that guy that threatened those two boys, wrong. He was wrong. Maybe he himself had been sexually abused and saw that as a way to reenact revenge. Also, let's...
Look what happened to the motherland. They don't want to treat blacks the same as another man. And just cause our skin's different colour and I don't change colour, but they call me a coloured man. There's only so much you can take in when your head's nappy with the shade of a slave's skin. The ghetto spent most of my days in. I ain't in prison, but I feel like I'm caged in. And I don't even need a chorus. It's the type of number that I dedicate to Stephen Lawrence. And it's gutted down here. Everybody's broke. We just need money down here.
Today I'll be discussing PTSD in the hood, in the ends, whatever you want to call it. Urban communities for some people, I guess. I thought I'd start with a clip and just to see what people get with this.
Pussy off, fam. What you doing with a mask on? What you doing with a mask on, fam? What the fuck? Who you riding on?
Who's riding?
Who you
Who's riding?
What the fuck you doing in my ends, fam?
What do you mean?
Man, shut the fuck up.
And the reason I started with that clip is I wanted people to see acts of violence, things that I believe had become normalized in our community, in our area or areas, urban areas. I'm from South London, from Croydon, and I think violence has just become something that's so normalized that when I showed that clip, I don't know how many people felt a vivid reaction. Or maybe you did because it was online, but when you see it and hear it in person, I wonder how many people have a numbing response. And that numbing response is typically a coping mechanism. And the reason I was inspired to do this, was the stabbing in Carnival. And sorry about the camera, I just kicked it. Was the stabbing at Carnival, and I didn't feel anything, you know. Didn't feel anything, if I'm being honest. I felt kind of numb. I thought, surprised it was just one. Part of me was like, rah, I missed it. And I think it's when I started to look into myself, I started to realize these were coping mechanisms that I had developed to just deal with the violence that had become very normalized in my area. I think alongside that as well, I see how other people react. So when I looked into what PTSD is a few years ago, to be honest, and I saw that sometimes it was being triggered by things. So for example, some friends of mine, some people who may relate to this will understand the feeling that they may go out on a date, for example, and they may want to see the exits, see the doors. And funny enough, when I was looking into PTSD, it was a war veteran that said the same thing, that when they go into restaurants, open public areas, aren't all, anyway, they would have a similar response. They would want to see the fire exits. They want to see the exits. They want to see everything. They would want their back to the wall so no one can jump them from behind. And I just vividly thought of my friends, some of my friends that had felt that, some of my friends who experienced some of that. I remember watching Conan's documentary about PTSD, and sometimes when he said he would have nightmares and waking up angry. And I would feel the same sometimes. I'd wake up vividly remembering things of the past. Things that had triggered me. Things that had, I guessed, I'd buried to the surface. So I think it's very interesting to analyze PTSD, and especially in urban communities. And I think the reason I'm so passionate about discussing this is because I wondered how much of this had been normalized that we didn't recognize it as post-traumatic stress disorder. And I placed this onto people. If you're from Croydon, it'd be a story that you're familiar with. I wanted to do a disclaimer because I do know, I have friends who know the person involved or people involved. And if you remember the incident with one guy making two younger guys kiss, threatened them with a knife. I don't want to name names. I don't want to get into it. But as an adult, if we look at that situation retrospectively, did we ever hazard to think that that situation maybe was actually sexual harassment? It wasn't just an act of violence. It was sexual harassment. You've made two people commit a sexual act under a knife. Also, to the incident I brought up with the older guy, and making the two younger guys kiss. I think the older guy was maybe 15, 16. I don't remember. And the other two were between the ages of 13 and 14. I'm not trying to justify it at all. I definitely think it's a form of sexual assault. But I'm bringing this up to bring a counterpoint to my own point. Have we ever thought about this? And people are going to hate me, but I'm going to do it. That maybe that guy that threatened those two boys, wrong. He was wrong. Maybe he himself had been sexually abused and saw that as a way to reenact revenge. Also, let's bear in mind, I don't remember him being, I don't think he was older than 16. Impossible, in fact. I don't think he could have been older than 16. Have we thought about that? Him being maybe he had been a victim of sexual assault as a younger person. A lot of people at the time were saying, how can you look at two boys, catch them slipping and think, kiss? Why are you not thinking just rob them or punch them up or stab them or whatever? Maybe he was someone that was battling with his sexuality. I do not mean that in a jokey way. I know in my community, my environment, that's me taking a piss, but I mean that very, very seriously. That maybe he's someone that was battling with his own sexuality, and maybe he repressed his own sexuality, and the only way he knew how to exhibit it was through violence. That's not excusing it, but I think understanding it will allow us to prevent it happening again. I think sometimes when I try to present the other side of the argument, people think it's enabling, but instead of it being enabling, I view it as something, trying to understand it to prevent it happening again. And I bring up that the sexuality, maybe being sexually abused, that if we have more open dialogue about this, that those hurt sexual abused don't grow to become abusers. Not everyone who's sexually abused becomes abusers. That's not the narrative I'm trying to spin, but some do. And if we have open dialogue about men as well being sexually abused, women as well being sexually abused, that we will have a wider scope and a better understanding of these issues, and it prevents them from happening again. And a better understanding of different people's preferences of sexuality. And when I think about it like that, I remember thinking, I just completely normalized that, thinking, okay, if I get into an incident and that happens, I've got to be prepared. I've got to do this, got to do that. I've got to be prepared to get stabbed. That's sort of what happens in war. Now, I know everyone's thinking, oh, it's not a war, blah, blah, blah. But what I mean is, when people were afraid to get captured, or people were in enemy territory, I've seen movies about it, and they had fear that they would be captured. Work with me with this one. They would discuss how they would respond to being captured. What would they do? So you're a normal teenager going through life, seeing someone be targeted, and I don't want to say anything about that too much, but we all had a similar response. Yeah, what? This is what I'll do in that situation. This is what I'll do in that situation. I'll do this, I'll do that. You're responding to how you would if you were in a torture situation. That's torture, for lack of a better word. And when you grow up as an adult, you become weary. Some people are scared to go to certain areas. Some people have nightmares, and it's definitely a spectrum. Some people, some people's PTSD is more extreme because they've had more extreme violence. Some people's in the lower end. Some people just have a numbing effect to the violence in their area, the violence in the community. So it's most definitely a spectrum. It's most definitely something that we have to look at carefully and not label people who just have, I don't want to say regular trauma, but different sorts of trauma. And I guess what I'm trying to say is we've got to be careful with how we label it. But I'm bringing this topic to the forefront because I don't want people like myself in the past to misdiagnose some of their feelings as something else when it's actually a response to the traumas that they've seen, been through, or heard of sometimes. That brings me to my second point, and it's more when I was discussing this with women, discussing this with other people about the traumas that they had seen. Now, I'm not calling sexual harassment and trying to put that together as PTSD, but how it's about the normalization of certain violent behaviors. How many women were groped, harassed as we were growing up, and how that behavior became normalized. And I'm bringing that up to discuss the normalization of violence in our areas. For example, what's a train? What is a train? A train is a rape scene. Period. Like, several guys, whether the woman knows or doesn't know, having sex with a girl who's just laying there, that's a train. That's a train, and that is actually a rape. But when we were growing up, I'm sure, hopefully, as I said, adults recognize it, but as we were growing up, that was normalized. To go even further, if a girl had had a train run on her, we'd call her a hoe. We'd call her a hoe. And, sorry. So not only has that person been a victim of rape, they've been shamed for that victimization. They're no longer allowed to express their anger, their frustration in it. They're labeled as a hoe, and I find that another form of where, I guess this is where I'm divulging off a little bit from the PTSD in urban communities, but just trauma in urban communities, how it's silenced. Keisha Diskette, written by Jade LD, discusses women's bodies, and her description of Keisha was a sexually liberated person who was shamed for her sexual liberation. And I bring that up to say that women who were maybe sexually more liberated, open, were hoe shamed. In other communities, not so much. But in our community, urban communities, go as far as to say black communities, shamed. And sometimes that's to do with, we fear what will be perceived by the outside world, so we feel shaming them will put them in the right track where they will be accepted by the white world, the middle class world, whatever you want to call it. But not realizing, sometimes we forget the damage that does to the individual and the self-hate that creates. And we talk about women being feminine all the time, and women need to learn to accept men's masculinity and men's leadership, but not realizing the pain that they've dealt with and the anger that stores inside them. And how can you be soft when there's anger stored inside? And sadly, feminists say this a lot, but sadly, behind a lot of women's pains is a man. Not always her boyfriend or ex or da da da. It could be a father figure, whatever. But I brought that up to say is, you see how behaviors are normalized. Groping is sexual harassment. We all know that now, but at the time it was normalized. It was fun. It was cool. It was whatever. And women were trained to just shut up and get on with it. And now when men approach a woman and they see them, they got a screw face or they're trying to avoid eye contact, we might say they're stush or they think they're nice, but maybe that comes from a place of they've been harassed, pushed around, made to feel uncomfortable so much that they just focus on their direct target and they're not trying to conversate too much because people have taken advantage. We could say that about a screw face with a guy that's got a screw face on. Maybe that comes from a place of, I want to look as intimidating as possible so that you don't start something with me, because I've seen how if people look friendly and approachable, how they get treated, how they get mistreated. I don't know. I guess that's food for thought. And that brings me to another point to cut into the Jade and Keisha the Sketch story, that some of the women who were very openly sexually liberal when we were younger, maybe they had been abused themselves. And we never looked at it like that. And it's not just saying because you're openly sexual, you were abused. But I think having more open dialogue will help these issues. Now, again, how do you control this? Because like I said earlier, you introduce the conversation more. It makes people more hyper aware and focus in on it more. It's a difficult battle to navigate, but I think avoidance isn't the way. I'm just bringing that as another wrinkle into the conversation. No, there's no right or wrong. These are just different ways of exploring the problem. And I think that links in very clearly into my next point. That links very clearly into my next point about suppressed emotions in urban communities, the Endz, hood, whatever you want to call it. How we suppress emotions, how only I think a select number of emotions, especially in men, but in general, are freely allowed to be expressed. Even in the manosphere, although I do feel like the manosphere does some good, there's some bad about, no one cares. And I might get a bit emotional saying this, but sometimes I do feel like that. But there are people that do care. There's still a slight taboo about counseling and reaching out to people, but at the same time it's opening up. But have the conversations changed? How we treat each other change? I haven't seen it just yet, but I'm older and it might be too late for me, but we'll see how it goes with the younger generation. But there is something to be said about, the more aware you make people of something, the more they focus in on it and embellish it. So for example, there was a podcast I did on Almost a Conversation. My friend Jamal discussed essentially a suicide forest that people went to in Japan, and they would announce the numbers, and the numbers would steadily increase. And they felt that the awareness of this suicide forest and the increase of numbers was increasing the likelihood of people wanting to go out there. And I bring that up to say, maybe the more you discuss mental health, the more people self-diagnose themselves, for lack of a better word. But picking back in what I was saying about suppressed emotions, I think as a man, I'd say this: one of the few emotions you're really allowed to show is anger. And only a certain level of anger. Yet as human beings, we feel the full spectrum of emotions. We feel the full spectrum of emotions as men. Pain, heartbreak, anger, betrayal, disappointment, stress, anxiety. Now that's not to diminish anyone who experiences severe depression, severe anxiety. It's just to say that as human beings, these are feelings that we all feel, we all experience. the culture we have, even the music we kind of listen to, it embellishes one, suppresses the other. We are getting better. Even this conversation, the fact that I can do it and not feel like I'm the first one, it does help. Even talking about my own traumas, I know I haven't gone into great depth, but it comes from that we are opening up the doors. But I do believe we still got a long way to go. A lot of people have kept a lot of emotions bottled up and suppressed, and it does come from the era we are, where, you know, bullying was normalized as a kid, and kids do bully. It's throughout all cultures, all classes. It's not just an urban community thing, but I believe in the Endz, in the hood, whatever, you're told to shut up and get on with it. The world doesn't care about your problems. But if you don't care about your problems, they never get resolved. So the shut up and get on with it attitude doesn't actually help anyone. And I'm not telling people to stop and wallow, but try to deal with some of your problems. And I think the way that our communities are, too often they are overlooked. Although, again, I do repeat, they are getting better. They are getting better. And there's a lot of anecdotal stories I can bring. I've got friends who have been in so much violence. They're not guys. This is the thing. You might think they're like the typical roadman or whatever. They're not. They're not. But maybe cousin was something, brother was something, and they had to, from a very early age, fight, defend themselves, whatever. And it makes them, as adults, standoffish, slightly antisocial. Some people struggle with sleep. Some people struggle with being in social environments. Some people struggle with friendships and trust because of betrayal and different postcode wars and blah, 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 blah. There's so much to unpack with PTSD. I think that's why I did this breakdown episode a little bit differently. That it leaves a lot of people wounded with quote unquote war scars. One of my friends said, not one of my friends, George, he had a lyric.
Grew up and inherited pain from our fathers. Bros got PTSD from the Gaza. The war wounds run real deep, fuck a plaster.
And I think that clip illustrates exactly what I'm talking about when I say you're left with war wounds. And if left unresolved and dealt with and really explored, they never fully heal. I used to have reoccurring nightmare. Several reoccurring nightmares. I had one where one of my friends had got rushed and all I could do was watch. I think it was a state of sleep paralysis. I had other reoccurring nightmares about being in school, jokes people used to make at me and I couldn't speak. Just loads of ones, other more violent ones, don't want to really get into too much. By the way, I have spoke to people about this, I've spoke to professionals about this, that's why I feel a bit more comfortable talking about it. But I think I think the trauma, when not dealt with, people will be surprised how it's normalized and manifests into everyday society. Some people say some people are just paranoid. You know, being overly observant. Have thought of that as paranoia? Not saying if you're observant, you're paranoid. If you're extremely observant, you're paranoid. I'm just saying that some people who are overly observant, always analyzing, that comes from a state of fear. That comes from a state of uncomfortability, not trusting your surroundings. And when you've been in untrustworthy surroundings, that can cause panic. That can cause uncomfortability. And that's why some people who stay silent and watching the room and always analyzing the room, because they themselves have been in rooms where they didn't do that and they were taken advantage of. And when you've come from violent backgrounds, seeing violent things, there's a state of unsafe. There's a state of unsafeness that you will always have. You always have. But of course, you can't miss out this bit where the parents. It's not Power Rangers. The parents are there. If you never watch Power Rangers, you will never get that joke. But in Power Rangers, the parents were never there. So yeah, if it was a dead joke, sorry, bruv. Get over it. I think some of it comes from our parents' generation. They didn't deal with their mental health. What was that? So for them, especially when you're from the Endz, you're from the hood, you're from whatever you want to call it, like they're just trying to feed you and keep a house over your head and pay their bills and have some semblance of life. That your anxiety about going into school, this girl not liking you, this guy being hyper aggressive to you and you not knowing how to react. A lot of us were taught, someone hits you, hit them back, innit? And I agree with it. I'm not disbanding that, but we were never taught or taught to deal with the emotions that we felt. Old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's cap. It's cap. Both that shit hurts. Both that shit hurts. And when you have parents that they themselves have had suppressed emotions, that we have fathers who are emotionally unavailable, mums who sometimes are single mums who've been silenced themselves, who have got pent up anger that they've never dealt with, and sometimes take it out on their children, sometimes just go numb and quiet. What really is the hope for us? And I say that to say this, that we are now, a lot of my friends are in their mid to late 20s, early 30s. Some of my friends in their mid 30s as well, actually. That let's not make the mistakes of our parents, not because we're better than our parents, but we just know more now. And that if we deal with our emotions, we can help our children of the future deal with theirs. And dealing with your emotions is scary. There's a lot buried underneath the carpet. And it can feel like, if you've ever had a messy house, that you are overwhelmed. You know, all of us are just kids who were looking for love at one point, looking for love and acceptance, and were thrusted into this world and had to, like myself, have to be hyper aggressive to feel safe. And for some others, had to be hyper rude, hyper sexualized, hyper whatever to feel some sort of acceptance. And I think going into that, unpacking that, will help our children not deal with what they dealt with before. But saying that, everyone here, a lot of people I know, there's triumphal stories. The stories of triumph, the stories of overcoming adversity is not something we should ever overlook. Those feelings of overcoming adversity, getting a good education, getting a good job, having a stable relationship. It is so normalized to have unstable relationships in our area that being a fuckboy is very cool. And I'm not saying that in other communities, being a player, being a fuckboy isn't cool. But it is so normalized having multiple baby moms, baby dads, that it's like we never take a second to say this is not normal. We never take a second. That was my whole rant before, and maybe it felt too much of a rant and you didn't quite understand what I was saying, but it's so normalized to go into relationships with extreme baggage and pain and unsuppressed issues, and it's like, it just is what it is. And no one ever takes a second to just think, how about, why isn't it a bigger push to normalize healthy relationships instead of just a picture that looks cool of like a Barack Obama and Michelle Obama? We never take that second to like look at that. And I know relationships need a little bit of drama, a little bit of panache, but we have normalized negativity in this world so much. It actually leaves me in a state of uncomfortability half the time, you know? It makes me very uncomfortable or uncomfortable. Yeah. But like I said, we should celebrate those triumphs, those relationships, those healthy relationships, people in healthy, loving relationships, people who have not necessarily gone down a specific dark path to get to where they got to, business owners, you know, friends who have pursued music careers and have done really, really well. We should take time to celebrate those triumphs and look at them as overcoming adversity and achieving certain things, but not just the materialistic things as well. Look at that as an example of achieving obstacles, overcoming obstacles we should look at those examples of overcoming obstacles and reaching certain levels of success. Some of those are more tangible, materialistic ones, but there's other emotional ones. And I think we should really, really look at that and praise that. And, you know, I know this episode might be a bit of a downer and a darker one, but I think we should look at those triumphs. And there's so many, despite our problems, despite the corrosive nature of the area that we're in. And sometimes it does feel like the system is set up against us, but there are so many people, not just prominent people, just in the day-to-day, who are living examples of being more than the area that they're from, being more than the toxic environment they're from, that we should focus on that more than just the sterile negativity that can overwhelm us and make us feel, well, we've got our problems, whatever, I'm going to just avoid them and get on with life. That's not the way. So if you take anything from this, if you get this far, is to look inside yourself, which I try to do every day myself, sometimes to the detriment of myself, sometimes it's a bit heartbreaking, and try day to day to just be better and be honest with yourself. I'm even saying that to myself as well. Get help where you can. Get help if you think you need to get help. There's nothing wrong with that. Go in to speak to someone about your mental health. It's like going to see a GP. I've done counselling for 2.5 years. I don't do it anymore, but I've been journaling for over 1.5 years. There's no shame in that. And there are amples of examples of triumph, no matter how hard the story is. I hope you enjoyed that. Please like, share, and subscribe. For anyone there that supports me, I just want to say a big thank you. Sometimes I want to quit, but those messages I get every now and again, they really keep me going. So thank you.
Yo, look, no, we ain't hooligans, just young and talented Nubians with potential and promise. Innovative young masterminds like Sean Wallace. We need role models so youngers know what success is. That's why I feel bomb inside when I see a black man like Tim Campbell can win The Apprentice. But when Smith made cry, I ain't gonna lie, I could have cried. Look what happened to the motherland. They don't want to see blacks the same as another man. When I heard that line, that sent tingles down my spine. Shout out all them ebony dimes, Katie Pearl and Keisha White, Miss Dynamite, Sadie, Desiree Sade, hang tight, Beverly Knight. Black diamonds, what a heavenly sight. Soon we'll be getting it right. See yourself as equal. Big up PDC and North Star, cause there's strength in numbers when you're